What's up guys, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. So with Halloween just around the corner, I thought we would create something a little more scary for this week's model. So we're making Freddy Krueger's glove. So let's just dive into it. Alright, so when it came to recreating Freddy Krueger's glove, this would be a perfect model to bring into software like ZBrush, where I could create a really high dense, high poly model, and I could recreate all of those different fabrics in the glove and all those wrinkles in the leather. However, I don't have a lot of time this week, so I thought it'd be fun and also kind of challenging to just stay within Maya and see what we could recreate. Now, to save a lot of time on this model, I thought we could just cut a few corners at the beginning and take advantage of Maya's content browser. So once you open up the content browser, you'll see that there's a sculpting base meshes folder in the modeling folder. So let's go ahead and double click that and then we can start blocking everything out. Alright, so firstly we're going to delete all of those armor pieces that are over the fingers. Then we're going to start deleting some of those faces over the back of the hand. We're going to start blocking out that metal pieces on the back of Freddy's glove. Now I'm not going to worry about getting everything perfect right off the bat, we're just going to roughly block it out and then we can slowly put things together. And then really quickly we're going to go up to the edit tab and we're going to go down to duplicate special. We're going to duplicate this model along the x-axis so we can flip it over to the opposite side. Freddy's glove is on the right hand and not the left, so we want to make sure we get that correct right off the start. Alright, so next up is just deleting all of those faces on the bottom of that metal piece that's on the top of the hand. That way it's one-sided and it's going to make it easier to block everything out. Alright, so now that we have that metal piece roughly blocked out, let's go ahead and duplicate this hand object. So what we're going to do here is highlight all of the tips of the fingers, and then I can extract it from the model. It's just going to separate those tips, and that way we can start blocking out those metal pieces that help hold the blades in place, that kind of sit over top of Freddy's fingers. So if you look at Freddy's glove, basically these metal pieces are kind of cut in half, so that's what we did. We're just going to chop it in half, so the metal piece is only sitting on the top of the finger. And then for the second part of this finger, we're just going to duplicate that same object, slide it back, and I can chop off the tip of the finger so it's not rounded. Freddy's glove basically has two metal pieces on the fingers, so that's exactly what we're trying to create. Now I'm just going to focus on one finger first. It's just going to be easier to block everything out, and then I can easily just duplicate it for all the other fingers on the glove. Now I'm just going to speed this part up a little bit. I'm just messing around with all the vertices so it fits nicely. I want to make sure I get this first finger correct, that way I can easily just duplicate it to create all the others. If I rush this part, I can easily run into problems once I start duplicating it and I'll have to delete the other fingers and it just quickly can blow up. So we're just going to take some time moving these vertices around, making sure it looks correct, and then I can start duplicating it over. Now when it comes to Freddy's glove, it actually changes quite drastically throughout all the movies. So the more I was looking at references, the more confused I got and I didn't know exactly which direction I wanted to go. What I ended up doing was just settling on the original. Nothing beats the classic, so I was focusing on the glove that's in the very first movie, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now I'm also a really big Freddy Krueger fan. I grew up loving these movies, so I knew this was going to be challenging because I had a critical eye and I knew that the model would never really look 100% correct. However, I was still pretty happy with how it turned out. I do think that we could have had some better results if I brought it into ZBrush and I spent a few more hours sculpting it and really spending time getting all those little details like the threads in the cloth and the wrinkles in the leather. However, I do have family visiting and I don't have a lot of time just to sit here and sculpt, so we're just going to see what we can do directly here in Maya. So as you can see, I was starting to block out those blades that are on the tip of his fingers. So all I did for that was start off with a cube and squish that nice and thin, and we can start extruding some of those edges to give it that curve like his blade has. And then I'm also going to just quickly add a plain blend material just so I can change the color on this metal so it doesn't look all skin color. Alright, so now that we have one finger roughly blocked out, now don't get me wrong, it's not looking correct yet, but I do want to move on and kind of get this whole model roughly into position, and it's going to help me figure out all of these shapes. So now that we have one finger roughly blocked out, let's go ahead and start moving on to the second one. We're just going to repeat the same process. We're going to start off with the tip of the finger, move on to the piece behind it, and then we can add on that blade. Now I'm just going to keep duplicating that same blade piece over since it's going to make our life a little easier. So let's go ahead and start finishing all of these fingers, and then we can move on to some more exciting things. Alright, so now that we have the glove roughly blocked out, we can go ahead and mess around with this hand object. I don't want it to be an actual hand, I want this to be more like a glove. So to make it a little more realistic, we're going to delete all of those faces on the bottom of the wrist. That way it can be nice and opened on the bottom, so it looks like you can fit a hand right into there. And then we're also going to start messing around with some of these vertices. So right now the glove is looking a little bit tight, like it's an actual hand. So we're going to spread it out a little bit to make it look not as human-like and more like a glove material. And I also want to add a seam along all of the edges. So if you look at Freddy's glove, it has a seam that kind of goes up from the side of his wrist around his thumb and then kind of over each finger, kind of like the hands split in half and it's sewn together. So we're going to kind of create a seam by just selecting one of these edges that runs along all of those fingers, and I can give it a small bevel. That way when I hit 3 on my keyboard, it'll hold that hard edge and it looks like there's a seam there. Now we're going to have to play around with this object a little bit. I definitely spend quite some time messing around with vertices and slightly moving things around until it looked more accurate to what it looks like in real life. But it's definitely going to take a little bit of adjusting to get it looking more accurate. So let's go ahead and play around with this shape a little bit so we can make it look more like a glove. Alright, so the Freddy glove is slowly getting there, but next up I just want to create those little metal pieces that are helping holding those fingers in place. They're like little bolts or screws, so we're just going to create another cylinder, scale that nice and small, and I can start positioning those right where those fingers attach to the glove. And once again, I'm not going to worry about getting everything perfect right off the start. I just want to get these objects roughly in place, and then we can slightly modify it to look more realistic. Alright, so now that we have those little screws or bolts in place, let's go back to that glove model. Now at the very bottom where his wrist is, there's this harder edge where it's like a different darker material. So we're just going to make sure to add an extra edge loop, that way it looks like there's a nice border right at the bottom of the glove. And I also want to continue messing around with that glove shape. I don't want it looking too much like a hand, I want it looking more like a glove so it's not perfect form. So we're just going to continue messing around with these vertices, making sure that they're not poking through any of our faces on our metal pieces. And we're just going to continue playing around with this shape a little bit more to get it looking more accurate. Alright, so now that the glove is looking a little bit better, now keep in mind we're going to come back and continue doing things, but for now it's looking good. We're just going to move on to those metal pieces. I just want to add a little bit of thickness since they're only one-sided, so what we're going to start doing is selecting all of those faces, hitting extrude, then we can give it a little bit of thickness. And I'm also going to make sure to add a few edge loops around to stiffen up those harder edges, that way when I hit 3 on my keyboard and I smooth that object out, it kind of retains those hard edges and it retains its shape. So let's go ahead and start adding some thickness to those metal pieces. Now I'm just going to speed up this next part of the video. It's the exact same process over and over again, so rather than making this video a lot longer than it has to be, I'm just going to speed up this portion until all of those metal pieces are double-sided. Alright, so now that all of those metal pieces are double-sided, we're just gonna move on to the opposite side of the glove where the palm is. So on all of those fingers, there's these little metal rings or loops that the fingers go into that help you hold on to the glove. So to do that, we're gonna create a cylinder. We can scale that nice and small and start blocking out that little ring shape. Once we get one roughly in the shape we're looking for, we can start duplicating those into all of the other positions on all of the other fingers. Now Freddy's glove also has these holes in the palm, so we're going to do the exact same thing by just deleting some of these faces. I believe there's 2 cuts on each finger and then a nice big cut right where the palm is. So we're going to go for roughly the same thing. We're just going to start deleting some of these faces to create some of those holes. Alright, so the glove is looking good and we're slowly getting there. Next up is working on the back where that little strap is. Now this changes throughout all of the movies, so if you're looking at reference, you'll notice how in the first couple of movies there's a strap that sits basically across the whole back of the palm, and throughout all the movies that slightly changes. So in the second movie, I think, or the third, there's just a string that's kind of coming down the middle, and then the whole glove starts to change shape as the movies progress. Now, I still think the first glove is the OG, and it's probably the best looking in my opinion, so we're modeling it after that shape. So in that glove, there's a strap that basically sits right on the back. So what we're going to do is start off with a small cube to act as if that little leather piece that has that buckle where that rope or that string ties into. And then we're just going to create another small plane, and I can start extruding those edges to create that string that sits on the back. And we're just going to roughly block the shape out. We can always add more polys to the shape down the road. We just want to get these shapes into the position that I'm looking for. Alright, so the glove is looking good and that strap is basically complete. We're just going to add a small little ball or sphere that sits on the bottom of that string later on. But really quickly, we're just going to add thickness to our glove itself. So right now it's only one-sided and I want to do some cool renders showing the palm side. and there would definitely be a little bit of thickness to that leather material. So we're gonna do the exact same thing we've been doing. We're gonna select all of those faces, extrude it, give it a little bit of thickness, and then I can add a few edge loops on those edges where those cutouts are so it can help retain its shape. Alright, and just like I mentioned earlier, we're going to create that small red ball that sits on the bottom of that string. So we're just going to create a small sphere and we can fit that into place. Alright, so really quickly before we started smoothing out some of these objects, I just created off camera another string that's in the second or third movie. Instead of that strap that goes around the back of the hand, it just has a string that drops down directly behind that metal piece that's on the back of the hand. So I just modeled this really quickly to see how I thought it looked. However, I didn't end up going with this. I still kept to the original glove that has that strap. And I also find it makes the model look a little bit more interesting anyways. So don't worry about this little piece of string that you see here. I was just experimenting with a few things, but I do end up going back to the original model that we created. Alright, so next up is smoothing out some of these meshes. So we're going to start off with the palm, and I'm going to go up to mesh and smooth. However, I am going to keep another copy, so I do duplicate the glove first before I smooth it out. That way I have the original lower poly model, just in case I want to jump back to fix a few things. Now after I smooth out the shape, I'm just going to go into those seams I created. We can double click some of those edges, and I can just scale them in a little smaller to help define those edges. I want to make it look like there's an actual seam there, and it's not just a bump in the material. I want it to look like it's actually two pieces that are sewn together. And later on in Substance Painter, we're going to actually add those stitching effects directly onto the material. Now I am also going to add a wrinkle effect into that leather material as well, but it's also going to help if I can create some of that into the geometry. So we're going to go with the soft select brush, and I can start selecting some of these edges and giving it a slight indent so it looks like it's a little wrinkle effect that's into that material. The way I look at it is if I can add that wrinkle effect into the geometry as well as into the material in Substance Painter, hopefully we can really get some great results and it can look a little bit realistic. Now don't get me wrong, if you really wanted to go for a truly realistic model, the best way I could see you achieving that is with a program like ZBrush or a sculpting software. That way you can really create a high dense mesh and you can really create some great wrinkle effects directly into that geometry. However, in this case, we're not going to spend hours and hours sculpting and adding those details. We're just going to do it directly here in Maya really quickly. So let's go ahead and start adding a few small wrinkles as well. Oh, and I'm also going to spend a little bit of time denting up this metal. I don't want it to look perfectly smooth, especially around those fingers. I want to take some of those polys and just move them slightly so it looks like they're off, and it looks like the metal's a little warped and dented. Alright, and last but not least is adding a little pin that's going to help hold this glove together. So on the very front where that rip in the palm is, right below where the wrist, I'm going to have a pin that's actually holding that material together. So we're just going to create a small torus, and I'm just going to chop that in half and start blocking out what a pin would roughly look like. Now I'm not going to spend too much time getting this pin perfect. It's going to be such a small object on this model. So we're just going to roughly get it into the shape of a pin, and then we can scale it down and fit it right onto our model where it's holding those two pieces of leather together. Alright, and that's basically everything for the modeling. Now really quickly, I'm going to show you exactly how I did those UVs, and then we can jump into Substance Painter and we can start texturing. Alright, so here's the model in its finished form. Now I ended up going in and denting up a few more of these metal pieces, so if you look at these fingers, you'll see that they're a little more warped, and I thought it would help look a little realistic because Freddy's glove is pretty banged up in the movie. And I also, like I mentioned, went back to the original strap that's behind the palm. Now all I did was create a hole inside of this cylinder that we created for the pin. That way I can have this piece of fabric that looks like it's part of the string that actually wraps through it. So I'm just faking it by adding a little hole in another piece of geometry. Other than that, that's basically the whole thing. Like I said, I went through and just messed around with some of these vertices to make it look a little more wrinkly on the glove. But everything is basically the exact same as we did in the modeling process. So I ended up breaking this object up into two groups for the two different textures applied. So very straightforward, I made one for the hand and one for the fingers, which is basically all the metal pieces. So if I go ahead and open up that UV editor, I'll show you exactly how I put those UVs together. So for all of the fingers and all the metal pieces, I just decided to put those on their own map. And I just did a simple cut directly down the middle, so all these fingers are just two sides. And I just straightened them out as best as I could. I didn't worry about getting everything perfect. I had a lot of UV space to work with, so this is plenty, and I think this is going to work fine. I also made sure that the back faces on some of these objects were very small in my UV map. So if you look at this palm shape, this part is on the inside of the model and you're never going to see that detail, so I shrunk that down quite small in my UV map. That way I didn't really give any priority to this object, only to this outside face that's basically going to be right in view. I just made sure to give priority to the objects that were going to be in camera view. Now jumping over to the hand group, that's pretty straightforward. All I did was a cut into the UVs directly along that seam we created. That way it would look a little more realistic and I wouldn't have any strange changes in the textures on any of these faces. And I basically just split the glove into two. I also decided to add this back piece as well as this pin into this group as well. Now I could have probably done a better job on these UVs. To be honest with you, I rushed it and I didn't spend too much time. But as you can see, if we click on this checkered board here, I'm not getting any weird stretches and everything looks pretty good. So I think it's gonna look fine in Substance Painter. So that's basically how I did all of those UVs. So now let's quickly jump into Substance Painter so we can start texturing. Alright, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, let's go ahead and load in our FBX file from Maya. Once that's all loaded in and everything is looking good, we can jump over to our texture set settings, scroll down to bake mesh maps, and we can go ahead and bake out some textures. Alright, so we're going to start off at the top of our texture set list, which is our glove texture. Starting off with the glove, we're going to go over to our Smart Materials folder and I'm going to go choose that leather damage material to apply to those objects. Now when it comes to this glove, it definitely needed some tweaking. So I spent quite some time just adjusting colors and specularities depending on how I wanted it to look. The problem was every reference photo I came across on Google of Freddy Krueger's glove looked quite different from one another. So some were quite glossy, some were very rough, some the copper was very bright, and some the copper was very dark. So it was very frustrating and I basically had to just choose one specific image or a few that I would go after. Since it changed throughout all these images, I feel like I would never be satisfied with the model. So to make my life a little easier, I just decided to make it one specific color from one reference photo and just basically go from there. So starting with that leather damaged material, all I'm going to do here is just tweak some of those colors and specularities so it could look like that light cream sort of beige color that his glove tends to be in those earlier movies. So next was adding some folds or creases into that leather material. So I'm going to take advantage of one of these Smart Materials, the flannel fabric material that comes with Substance Painter. And inside of that folder is a really nice creases or folding effect that they have with that material. So I'm just going to copy that and steal it from that folder and I can just apply it to my glove. So on the bottom of Freddy's glove, there's a strip of material that's darker than the actual glove itself. So a really easy way to do this is just duplicate that same folder, that leather material we already have, and I can just change that color, and all I have to do is just apply it to specifically that mesh on the bottom. Now when I was doing the UVs, I made sure to do a cut right along that edge. That way when I was just going to apply this material, I could do it very easily. So next up is adding some stitches. So to do this, I'm just going to add a fill layer. I'm just going to drag that height slider quite low. That way I can have some nice bump and it looks like those stitches are directly imprinted into my leather material. And then I'm just going to turn that into a black mask. I'm going to search up stitches. I'm going to use one of those procedural stitching brushes that comes with Substance Painter. And then all I have to do is draw directly on my mesh depending on wherever I want those stitches to go. So I'm just going to follow those seams that I created earlier in my geometry, and I'm just going to create some sort of stitching effect right along that seam. Alright, so the stitches are looking good. Next is adding some more metal materials to these meshes. So I'm going to go over to my Smart Materials folder, select that Steel Ruin material, and I can just drag that directly onto my pin object, as well as that little buckle that helps hold that strap that's on the back of my glove. And then next up is just adding a material to that string. So I'm going to go over to my Materials folder and select that Fabric Rough material, and I can apply it to those meshes as well. All I have to do is just tweak that color so it's a little bit more of a beige color. Now Freddy's glove also has this little tiny red ball on the bottom of that string, so we're going to go select a glossy smart material and I can apply it to that ball as well. Just change that color so it's a nice dark red. Alright, so the strings are looking a little bit too clean, so we're just going to go add another fill layer, and I can go over to my masking folder and I can drag on whatever masking effect I would like, just so I can add a little bit of dirt and grunge to that material so it looks a little bit more worn out. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing to the glove as well. So I'm just going to go add a few fill layers, drag on a few masking effects just so I can add some more dirt and grunge to make the glove look a little bit more beaten up and worn out. Now I wanted the palm of the glove to be a little bit darker, and rather than just adding different masking effects, I thought I would just draw directly onto the geometry. So once again, we're going to add another fill layer. I'm going to drag that color nice and dark, and then I can just go ahead with my brush tool and start painting around all of those fingers and all of those holes just so it looks a little bit more dirty and grungy on the palm. Now originally I was trying to paint on and I couldn't figure out why it wasn't really painting on correctly, and that's just because I still have my stitching effect applied to my alpha below. So it takes me a little bit to figure that out, but eventually once I remove that stitching effect, I can start painting on my mesh properly. And then really quickly, before we moved on to our next texture set, I just decided to experiment a little bit more with different folding effects. And then once I was happy with how the model was looking, we can move on to our next texture. Alright, so next up was moving on to the metal. So for this, I decided to use that iron old smart material that comes with Substance Painter, and I just applied it to those meshes. Now what I did here was just change down the height value so it wasn't so bumpy, and then I just dragged up that roughness value so it looked a little bit more rough. And I also tweaked that color a little bit to make it look a little bit more like copper and less like metal. Now, like I mentioned earlier in the video, the color of this metal definitely varies depending on what reference photo you're looking at. So I definitely came back to this color multiple times and tweaked it along the way. That's why the color in those final renders are slightly different, because throughout the texturing process, I just kept jumping back to it and slightly tweaking things. Now, I don't know if you noticed it yet, but at the very bottom of my glove, I was getting this little black line on my leather material. And this was actually happening from a crease or folding effect that I applied to that leather material. So that was just bugging me, and for some reason I just wanted to fix it right now rather than later, so I'm going to quickly jump back to my glove texture, and we're going to go mess around with different folding and creasing effects just so I can apply a different effect to it to remove that little black line. Alright, so now that that little black line and folds are all fixed, let's jump back to that metal texture that we have, and we can continue on with those materials. So firstly, I'm just going to tweak some of these colors to make that copper look a little bit closer to what I had in mind, and then we can start adding a few other dirt and grunge effects over top of that. Now Freddy's glove is pretty beaten up. Depending on the reference you're looking at, it can actually look quite messy and really grungy. So I really liked how that was looking. I didn't want his glove to look too clean, especially because he comes from like a boiler room, and you know, Freddy's a pretty gnarly dude. So we want to make this glove look a little beaten up. So I'm going to add a fill layer, and I can go over to my masks tab and start dragging on whatever masking effect I would like, so I can add some more dirt and grunge to that metal texture. Now for the blades, I ended up going with the steel rust smart material. All I did here was just drag down that rust so it wasn't completely rusted over, and then similar to how we did before, I can add some more dirt and grunge over top of that material afterwards. Alright, so things are slowly coming along. Now I'm just going to quickly jump into the renderer to see how these materials are looking. And once inside the renderer, I'm just going to change my focal length down from 17 up to 35. And then I'm also going to remove the ground and change the environmental light. I changed the lighting to more of a studio light, that way I can have some nice rim light around the glove, and I always find the models look a little bit better. So at this point, it's just a matter of tweaking materials. So going forward, I'm just going to continue jumping in and out of the renderer and slightly changing materials and colors and different settings so I can make it look a little bit more accurate to what I had in mind. And I also continue to add different grunge and dirt effects as well. So I'll let this play out a tiny bit so you can see exactly what I'm doing, and then I'm going to fast forward the video a little bit so you can see the final model and I can go over exactly what I did. Alright, so here's a model in its finished form after I messed around with some of those settings and applied some more dirt and grunge. Now keep in mind these little dark areas around these screws, they're showing a little darker than they normally will outside of this program. Just in the editor they show a little bit dark, but once I actually jump into the renderer, so as you can see they softened up a little bit and they're just not looking so rough and black, and I find it just darkens up those areas around the screws a little bit more. and it just looks a little bit better. Now for some reason my computer is having a hard time recording at the same time as it's running in the renderer, so I'm just going to show you in the editor really quickly, and then we can just go over those final renders afterwards. So like I said, those little black areas, I added a little darkness around the screws. I also decided to add a little bit of bump around where the blades interact with the glove. So all I did for that was using the built-in welding brush that comes with Substance Painter. So if you go up to your search bar and you type in weld, this really nice weld brush that comes up, and all I did for that was create a fill layer and then just draw on around that area. And just make sure to raise up that height value so it looks like there's actually bump in the material. Other than that, I just went through and added a little bit more dirt and grunge, and I took some away in certain areas. And I also added this little rusty kind of red material on the palm, just to make it look a little bit more beaten up. But everything you saw in the texturing process is basically everything that I did to texture this Freddy Krueger glove. Now, like I said, this is definitely a model that I feel like the more time you spend, you're really going to get better results. Those little details make such a big difference. And like I mentioned earlier, if you have the time to actually throw this model into a sculpting program like ZBrush, you can probably get much better results when it comes to details like wrinkles and folding effects and creases. That being said, I'm still really happy with how this model turned out. I'm a big Nightmare on Elm Street Freddy Krueger fan, so it was definitely stepping out of my comfort zone, but it was a lot of fun to recreate. Alright, so thanks so much for tuning in to this week's video. If you liked it, give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to see more weekly 3D content. Alright, thanks for tuning in, and happy Halloween.